It started with a question no one wants to imagine. What would you do if you could erase someone's life with a single transaction? Not their memories, not their history in the world, but the tangible proof of who they were, their secrets, their documents, their very existence in records that mattered. And what if the price for that erasure was $50 million? You might think that's the plot of a Hollywood thriller, something that belongs on the big screen. But in the Reiner family, this shocking scenario became real. On a Sunday in December, the luxurious tranquility of Brentwood, Los Angeles, was shattered. Rob Reiner, the legendary director, and his wife Michelle, both pillars in their respective worlds, were found dead in their $13.5 million estate. Their lives didn't end in a quiet home accident or in the grip of some illness that could be mourned quietly and privately. No. They were stabbed, violently, repeatedly, leaving a trail of questions that would grip the city and the world in disbelief. The police would later classify the cause of death as multiple sharp force injuries and list the manner of death simply: homicide. The date was confirmed as Sunday, December 14th. The day started like any other Sunday in the affluent Brentwood neighborhood, but ended with tragedy that nobody, not even the family, could have anticipated. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The scene was discovered by their daughter Romy, 27, a young woman who had the misfortune of finding the aftermath of a nightmare no one would ever want to face. According to reports, Romy immediately flagged a dangerous family member, someone who she believed should be a suspect. That someone, as shocking as it sounds, was her own brother, Nick Reiner, who at 32 lived in a guest house on the property. By nightfall, Nick was in police custody, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The question that hung over everyone's heads was simple yet horrifying. How could a son turn on his own parents in such a brutal way? But even that horrifying detail, the arrest, the charges, the police investigation, was only the beginning. There were whispers, rumors, early reports that hinted at something much darker, something more calculated than a moment of rage. And then, just as the story was already splintering headlines, the FBI entered the picture. What they discovered has sent shockwaves far beyond the family estate. Tracy Reiner, Nick's relative, has been implicated as an alleged accomplice. The allegation isn't just casual involvement. It's tied to one of the most audacious propositions you could imagine. According to federal sources, Tracy and Nick allegedly offered $50 million to erase Rob and Michelle Reiner's files. Not just financial records or mundane documents, but files that contained secrets, evidence, perhaps even proof of matters that could have rocked Hollywood or exposed family skeletons. Pause and let that sink in. $50 million. An offer to erase someone's life and records, to make them, in a sense, disappear from certain systems of accountability. It reads like fiction. It reads like the kind of story you'd tell in a high-stakes Netflix drama. But the evidence is very real. And the consequences are even more terrifying. The files themselves remain shrouded in mystery. Investigators have confirmed their existence, but are being deliberately tight-lipped about their contents. Were they legal documents? Personal journals? Correspondence with industry insiders? Or something darker, something tied to investigations that the public has yet to learn about? Every rumor only fuels the intrigue, and every unanswered question deepens the sense that this story isn't just about a tragic murder. It's about secrets, power, money, and betrayal at a scale few can imagine. And then there's the human element, the emotional chaos that surrounds every detail. Romy's trauma, the shock of neighbors and friends, the disbelief of colleagues in Hollywood who knew Rob Reiner as a professional, a creator, a father figure. The juxtaposition is jarring. On one hand, the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, a life that seems untouchable. On the other, the raw, unfiltered horror of a family destroyed from within. It forces you to ask the uncomfortable questions. How well do we ever really know the people closest to us? How fragile is trust when money, power, and secrecy collide? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, could it have been prevented? In the hours following the discovery, police combed through the estate, piecing together a timeline that was as precise as it was disturbing. Nick had lived on the property for years, but his presence had never raised red flags until the fatal day. Meanwhile, investigators traced every movement, every communication, and every connection between him and Tracy Reiner, revealing a network of conversations, proposals, and, ultimately, a plan that seems impossible to comprehend. There are indications that the discussions surrounding the $50 million offer were not fleeting or informal. They were methodical, strategic, and potentially actionable. If true, they paint a portrait of premeditation so cold it chills even seasoned detectives. But it's not just the FBI who has their work cut out. Media outlets are racing to uncover the threads, and social media is ablaze with speculation. Fans and followers, people who admired the Reiners' contributions to film and culture, are left grappling with the surreal idea that behind the curtain of celebrity lies a story so dark it almost defies reality. Every tweet, every headline, every whispered conversation only fuels the tension. The public is glued to every snippet of information, every leak, and every statement from authorities, desperate for clarity but confronted by an ever-deepening mystery. And yet, despite all the evidence, all the reporting, all the speculation, a sense of unfinished business lingers. The files, the offer, the motives, these remain obscured, tantalizingly out of reach. Every answer seems to lead to more questions, and every revelation carries with it the weight of disbelief. How did a son arrive at the point of killing his parents? Why was Tracy allegedly involved in a scheme so audacious it sounds implausible? What exactly was in the files that warranted $50 million for their erasure? These are the questions we will unravel in this story. Over the next hour, we will dive deep into every facet of the Reiner tragedy: the crime scene, the FBI investigation, the family dynamics, the alleged $50 million offer, and the emotional fallout. We will examine every report, every leak, and every claim to understand not only what happened, but why it happened, and what it means for a family, a legacy, and a public that has been left stunned. But before we go deeper, here's the truth you need to hold on to. The initial reports, the arrests, the allegations, they are only the surface. The layers beneath them are far more complex, far more shocking, and far more heartbreaking. And as we peel back those layers, you will come face to face with the reality that sometimes the people closest to us can be the most dangerous. And just when you think you have a grasp on the story, the files, the $50 million offer, and the FBI revelations, the real shocker emerges. What Nick and Tracy allegedly tried to erase is not just a record of life and legacy. It is a record of truths that someone, somewhere, desperately wanted to disappear. And as the investigation continues, the consequences of these actions are only beginning to surface. So buckle up. This is not just a murder story. This is a story of betrayal, greed, secrecy, and the horrifying lengths some will go to protect or destroy a legacy. The questions raised here don't have easy answers, and the revelations we are about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the Reiner family. It was a Sunday evening like any other, or at least, that's what the neighbors believed. The sun had long set over Brentwood, casting shadows across manicured lawns and the sprawling estates of Los Angeles' elite. Inside the Reiner residence, the atmosphere was supposed to be warm, familiar, and ordinary. Rob Reiner, the celebrated director and actor, and his wife Michelle, a woman known for her philanthropy and refined elegance, were expected to spend a quiet night at home. But ordinary Sunday nights can sometimes conceal unimaginable horrors, and this one would become a turning point in a story that no one saw coming. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came not from a scream, a disturbance, or a suspicious neighbor, but from within the family itself. Romy Reiner, 27, had gone to check on her parents. What she found would haunt her forever: the lifeless bodies of Rob and Michelle, a scene so brutal it defied comprehension. According to reports, Romy immediately recognized the severity of the situation. She didn't hesitate. She flagged someone she described as dangerous, a family member who, in her words, should be a suspect. That family member was her brother, Nick Reiner. At 32, Nick was living in the guest house on the estate. From the outside, it appeared as though he was just another member of the family, residing close to his parents. But within the walls of the Reiner estate, something far more sinister had been brewing. Detectives later revealed that the home itself held little in the way of forced entry signs. There were no broken windows, no disturbed locks, no struggle that would indicate a random intrusion. That made the scenario even more chilling. The killers, or killer, were already inside, already among the family. When the police arrived, the scene was surreal. Officers accustomed to high-profile cases in Hollywood were met with the stark contrast of opulence and carnage. Elegant furnishings splattered with blood, the remnants of a life brutally interrupted. Every detail mattered, every object told a story, and investigators worked meticulously to piece together the sequence of events. And yet, even in the chaos, the first question on everyone's mind was, how could this happen in a home that seemed so safe, so insulated from the outside world? Brentwood is a neighborhood known for its security, its privacy, and its sense of untouchable affluence. But no security cameras, alarms, or high walls could prevent what unfolded that night. Nick's arrest came swiftly, the culmination of Romy's early identification and subsequent police investigation. Charges of 2 counts of first-degree murder were brought against him, and the details of the case began to emerge in fragments. The media frenzy was immediate. Headlines screamed the names of the victims and the accused, painting a picture that was both sensational and deeply tragic. But even amidst the coverage, there were hints of layers deeper than anyone could see. The FBI's involvement added an almost cinematic dimension to the unfolding events. This was not a case of mere domestic violence. Federal investigators were drawn in not just by the brutality of the murders, but by something far more extraordinary: the alleged proposal by Nick and Tracy Reiner to erase critical files belonging to Rob and Michelle for a staggering $50 million. That revelation alone transformed the case from a shocking family murder into a story that suggested premeditation, financial motivation, and a level of calculated planning that seemed almost impossible to grasp. The night of the murders also revealed contradictions in the family narrative. Neighbors who had interacted with the Reiners spoke of ordinary Sunday routines: lights dimmed, quiet dinners, casual conversations. Yet behind closed doors, something had clearly escalated to violence. Why did this happen on that night? What precipitated the attack? And how did a son, someone who should have been safe, familiar, trusted, become the central figure in the crime? Investigators also began to uncover subtle clues about the family dynamics that might have contributed to the tragedy. Nick's residence in the guest house had always been framed as part of a close-knit family structure. Yet intimate relationships can conceal resentment, jealousy, and secrets. Romy's identification of her brother as a dangerous individual hinted at pre-existing concerns that apparently went unaddressed until it was too late. The timeline was painstakingly reconstructed. Sunday had begun like any other day, with routines, meetings, and family interactions. But somewhere along the line, tensions escalated. Forensic experts later described the sequence of injuries in meticulous detail, noting multiple sharp force wounds that indicated prolonged aggression, an almost ritualistic element to the attack, and a disturbing level of personal targeting. Each blow was deliberate, each action calculated. This was not a crime of impulse. It was an act of extreme violence executed with focus. Meanwhile, the surrounding community reacted in shock and disbelief. Brentwood, a neighborhood where celebrity sightings and casual garden parties are routine, had never seen anything like this. Neighbors described the police presence as overwhelming, a mix of patrol cars, flashing lights, and investigative vans that transformed the serene streets into a stage of tragedy. Friends and colleagues of the Reiners, many of whom were close to Rob through decades in Hollywood, expressed bewilderment and sorrow. In interviews, some could barely reconcile the image of a celebrated filmmaker with the image of a man whose life ended so violently at home. One of the most disturbing aspects of that night was the sense of betrayal intertwined with grief. This wasn't just the story of murder. It was the story of family betrayal, of trust shattered in the most permanent way possible. How does a family begin to process the idea that one of their own might be capable of such an act? How does a daughter reconcile her grief with the knowledge that her brother may have committed the crime? These are questions that lingered over investigators, reporters, and the public alike. As night fell over the estate, the investigation moved into its next phase. Forensic teams collected evidence, cataloging blood patterns, fingerprints, and trace materials that could piece together the sequence of the murders. Every drawer, every file, every surface was examined. And it was during these initial sweeps that the investigators began to uncover hints that there were items of extraordinary interest, documents and files whose importance went beyond the ordinary. Files that, according to preliminary FBI reports, were tied directly to the alleged $50 million proposal. This revelation transformed the case from a high-profile murder into a full-blown federal investigation. It was no longer just about a tragic Sunday evening in a wealthy neighborhood. It became a story about secrets, about the lengths some would go to protect or erase those secrets, and about the dangerous intersection of money, power, and family loyalty. By the time dawn broke over Brentwood, the magnitude of the tragedy was fully apparent. Rob and Michelle Reiner were gone. Their deaths were confirmed, the crime scene secured, and the initial reports disseminated to media outlets across the nation. The public was riveted, and the story was only beginning to unfold. Yet, despite the arrests, the evidence, and the FBI involvement, the night of horror left one overarching question. Why? Why would Nick Reiner allegedly commit such a violent act? And why was Tracy Reiner allegedly involved in a scheme to erase files worth millions? The answers were not immediately clear, and the path to uncovering them would reveal layers of family tension, financial dealings, and shocking secrets that had been hidden for years. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that this was not just a family tragedy. It was a story that exposed the fragility of trust, the corruption of ambition, and the horrifying potential for betrayal among those closest to us. The night of horror was the spark that ignited a chain of events that would captivate the world, but the flames of truth were only beginning to burn. From the outside, Nick Reiner seemed like any other son living close to his family. At 32, he resided in the guest house of the Brentwood estate, a stone's throw from his parents' sprawling $13.5 million home. To neighbors and casual acquaintances, it appeared ordinary. He had a presence on the property, but nothing alarming. Friends described him as quiet, sometimes withdrawn, but always respectful of the Reiner family. No one could have predicted that the man they knew as a son, a brother, and a relative could become the central figure in a story of unimaginable horror. But as investigators would soon discover, appearances were deceiving. Nick's life, like the estate he lived on, held secrets that were coming to light in fragments, each revelation darker than the last. Police reports indicate that his living arrangements, financial behavior, and personal relationships were scrutinized immediately after the murders. There were no forced entries on the estate. Nick's presence in the guest house meant he had proximity, access, and opportunity. And while opportunity alone doesn't equate to guilt, the combination of evidence, witness accounts, and forensic data began to paint a troubling picture. Nick had long been under the radar. Outside of family, very few had insight into his daily routines. Social media profiles were sparse, professional engagements modest, and interactions with friends carefully curated. Yet, within this quiet exterior, law enforcement suspected patterns that suggested premeditation. The FBI's involvement further complicated the narrative, as preliminary evidence hinted at calculated communications with Tracy Reiner about erasing crucial files for $50 million. This was not a spur-of-the-moment plan. This was methodical, deliberate, and financially motivated. Psychologists and criminal behavior experts reviewing the case began asking questions about familial relationships, long-standing resentments, and potential triggers. Nick's proximity to his parents, living on the property, could have provided both physical access and a psychological context for conflict. Experts point out that in cases of parricide, there is often a combination of emotional, financial, and psychological factors at play, sometimes extending years or even decades before the fatal act. The night of the murders revealed disturbing details about Nick's potential mindset. Investigators noted that the sharp force injuries to Rob and Michelle were both multiple and precise, indicating not only extreme aggression, but also a familiarity with the victim's routines and movements. This knowledge could only come from someone who had intimate access to the household, someone who knew when and where they would be most vulnerable. From this perspective, Nick was more than a suspect. He was the only person with both the motive and means to execute the crime so effectively. Financial motives also came under scrutiny. Preliminary FBI reports suggest that Nick, along with Tracy, discussed a $50 million offer to erase critical files belonging to Rob and Michelle. These weren't ordinary family documents. They contained records, personal correspondences, and possibly legal materials that someone deemed valuable enough to warrant millions. This revelation reframes the narrative entirely. The murders are no longer just about personal rage. They are tied to wealth, power, and perhaps a desperate attempt to control or erase damaging information. Friends and family have offered contrasting accounts of Nick's character. Some describe him as ambitious, sometimes overly cautious, and highly strategic in personal and financial matters. Others, including close relatives, hint at volatility, emotional detachment, and difficulty managing anger. These contradictions mirror the complexity of the investigation itself. Was Nick a calculated opportunist, a troubled son pushed to extremes, or both? And how much of his behavior was influenced by Tracy's alleged involvement? Romy's testimony provided critical insight into Nick's behavior leading up to the murders. She told investigators that she had observed concerning patterns over time: withdrawn behavior, secretive communications, and unusual interest in the family's personal files. While she had never anticipated violence, she described a growing unease that became undeniable on the day of the murders. Her early identification of Nick as dangerous proved pivotal in securing his arrest. Investigators also explored the psychological dynamics between siblings. The Reiner family, like many, had layers of tension and unspoken conflict. Some suggest that Nick may have felt overshadowed by his father's accomplishments or pressured by family expectations. Others propose that financial incentives and the potential to control the family's legacy may have amplified underlying resentment. Whatever the combination, the psychological portrait that emerged was of a man caught between ambition, fear, and a dangerous calculus of risk and reward. Legal analysts have noted the significance of proximity in parricide cases. Living on the same property, Nick had both access and observation. He knew the patterns of his parents' lives, their routines, habits, and vulnerabilities. Combined with the alleged discussions regarding the $50 million offer, investigators suggest this proximity may have facilitated not just the crime itself, but also the planning and execution. Each detail of the night, the timing, the method, the choice of location, aligns with a narrative of premeditation rather than spontaneous violence. The FBI's investigation extended beyond the immediate crime scene. Digital forensics, financial records, and communications between Nick and Tracy were analyzed for patterns of planning. Early reports indicate that encrypted messages, unusual banking transactions, and attempts to access sensitive files were all part of a broader strategy to manipulate, control, and, ultimately, eliminate the parents' influence. The level of sophistication raised questions about external guidance or coaching. Was Nick acting alone, or was he being directed by someone else within the family structure? Yet despite these mounting suspicions, the case is not without complexity. Some witnesses described Nick as a loving son, someone who expressed concern for his parents' well-being and participated in family life. These contradictions make the narrative difficult to reconcile. How does a son with apparent care and loyalty transition into a suspect in a brutal double homicide? The answer, investigators suggest, lies in a combination of financial temptation, psychological strain, and calculated opportunity, a perfect storm that culminated in tragedy. The community's reaction to Nick's arrest was immediate and visceral. Neighbors, accustomed to a quiet, orderly existence, found themselves grappling with the reality that the alleged perpetrator was a familiar figure, someone they had seen daily, perhaps waving from the driveway or walking along the property's private paths. Friends in Hollywood and social circles of the Reiners struggled with disbelief, unable to reconcile the image of a devoted son with that of a potential murderer. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement officials continued to emphasize that while Nick's arrest was a critical step, the full story had not yet emerged. The $50 million offer, the involvement of Tracy Reiner, and the mysterious files all added layers of intrigue that would unfold over the coming weeks and months. Each revelation promised to shed more light on motives, methods, and the true extent of planning behind the murders. Experts in criminal psychology note that cases like Nick Reiner's often involve a duality, the outward appearance of normalcy combined with hidden behaviors that escalate to violence. In Nick's case, investigators sought to trace every interaction, every decision, every moment that could have contributed to the night of horror. From his living arrangements to communications with family members, nothing was considered too small. Each detail could be the key to understanding why the unthinkable occurred. Public fascination with the case has only grown, fueled by the combination of celebrity, brutality, and financial intrigue. The question on everyone's mind: was Nick Reiner acting purely out of personal motives, or was he part of a larger plan orchestrated within the family? As authorities continue to investigate, the answers remain elusive, and every new leak, tip, or discovery adds another layer of complexity. And the most chilling aspect? While Nick Reiner sits in custody, the investigation suggests that his actions were only one part of a larger puzzle. The alleged discussions about erasing files for $50 million hint at a premeditated scheme, one that intertwines murder with greed, secrecy, and perhaps a desperate attempt to control the narrative of the Reiner family legacy. The story of Nick Reiner is not just the story of a suspect. It is the story of how proximity, opportunity, ambition, and secrecy can converge in ways that are almost impossible to anticipate. His role in the tragedy raises profound questions about trust, family dynamics, and the lengths individuals will go to protect or destroy a life. And just when investigators thought they were beginning to understand the motives, the communications between Nick and Tracy Reiner revealed an even more shocking layer of complexity. One that would force authorities, family members, and the public to question everything they thought they knew about loyalty, betrayal, and the true cost of secrets. When the story first broke, most people assumed they understood the key players: Nick Reiner, the son accused of brutally murdering his parents, and Rob and Michelle Reiner, the victims of an unthinkable act. But as investigators dug deeper, another figure emerged: Tracy Reiner. To the public, Tracy has long been known as an accomplished actress, a member of Hollywood royalty with connections that span decades. But behind that carefully curated image lay allegations that would turn her into one of the most controversial figures in the investigation. Was she an accomplice, a conspirator in a horrific plot, or merely a pawn caught in a family tragedy that spun out of control? The FBI's preliminary findings suggest that Tracy's involvement was far from incidental. Sources claim she had direct communication with Nick regarding the alleged $50 million offer to erase Rob and Michelle's files. These weren't casual conversations. Investigators described detailed discussions that implied knowledge of both the content and the potential consequences of these files. At the heart of the allegations is a chilling question: did Tracy knowingly participate in planning a crime that led to the death of her own family members? To understand the gravity of the situation, it's important to consider the stakes. The files in question are reportedly not mundane. They may contain personal correspondences, financial records, or documents tied to legal and professional matters of the Reiners. In the world of Hollywood and high finance, control of information can be power, and power, when mishandled, can become deadly. If Tracy and Nick indeed tried to erase these records for $50 million, they weren't just covering up minor indiscretions. They were targeting what investigators call critical family and professional intelligence. The implications are staggering. But what could drive someone like Tracy, an established figure with a career of her own, into involvement with such a plot? Psychologists and criminal behavior experts point to a combination of loyalty, fear, and financial incentive. Families with wealth and influence often operate under intense pressure, with complex dynamics that outsiders can rarely understand. When you layer secrecy, the potential for scandal, and enormous sums of money, the potential for manipulation and betrayal skyrockets. Tracy's alleged communications suggest that she may have been motivated not just by money, but by a desire to protect herself, her reputation, or even her position within the family structure. Eyewitnesses and insiders describe a relationship between Tracy and Nick that was unusually close. While siblings often collaborate on family matters, investigators noted a pattern of secrecy in their interactions, including private meetings and encrypted messages. Some suggest Tracy's role was one of influence, guiding, encouraging, or even orchestrating certain actions. Others contend that she may have been under pressure from Nick or driven by fear of losing access to wealth, status, or familial trust. The complexity of Tracy's potential involvement is compounded by her own public persona. In Hollywood, she is known for her professionalism, her talent, and her connection to one of the industry's most storied families. The idea that she could be implicated in a plot involving murder and a $50 million bribe feels almost surreal. But investigators emphasize that criminal behavior does not always correlate with public image. Those closest to the situation often have insights that outsiders can't see. And Rob Reiner's early statements indicate that she perceived Tracy as involved, though the exact nature of that involvement was unclear at first. Financial records obtained by investigators suggest that Tracy may have had access to resources or connections that could facilitate the alleged plan. Large transfers, meetings with advisors, and attempts to access sensitive documents were all flagged as potential evidence. Experts suggest that the sophistication of these actions indicates a level of planning and awareness that would be difficult to dismiss as coincidental or uninformed. In short, Tracy's potential involvement is not the result of a single decision. It appears to be part of a broader, calculated strategy. Yet, there are contradictions. Tracy has publicly denied any wrongdoing, asserting that she had no involvement in the murders or in any attempts to erase documents. She claims that any communications with Nick were innocuous, related to normal family discussions, and that she had no knowledge of his alleged intentions to commit murder. These statements are now being weighed against digital records, witness accounts, and forensic evidence. The discrepancies create tension within the investigation, forcing authorities to navigate a complex web of statements, behaviors, and potential motives. Legal experts have noted that proving complicity in a crime of this nature is challenging. The prosecution must demonstrate intent, knowledge, and active participation. For Tracy, the key question is whether her communications and actions indicate deliberate involvement in a plan that led to her parents' deaths. Defense attorneys argue that familial loyalty, concern for Nick, or even naivety could explain her behavior without crossing the threshold into criminal liability. The outcome will hinge on the interpretation of evidence, both digital and testimonial. Emotional dynamics within the Reiner family add another layer of complexity. Tracy is not just an alleged accomplice. She is a sister, a daughter, and a member of a family in mourning. The public often struggles to reconcile the duality of her role. How can someone simultaneously be a grieving family member and a potential participant in the planning of their deaths? Investigators and psychologists point out that in high-stakes familial conflicts, emotions, greed, fear, and loyalty can intertwine in ways that defy logic. This duality makes the case not just a legal puzzle, but a psychological one. One particularly perplexing aspect of Tracy's alleged involvement is her knowledge of the files. These were not ordinary documents. The files contained records, possibly tied to financial dealings, personal correspondences, or other sensitive materials. To be aware of their existence and their importance implies insider knowledge, either through her own access or through communication with Nick. The FBI has indicated that understanding the scope of these files is critical to determining the motive and the role each family member played. In addition to the financial and informational motives, there are hints of emotional and relational factors. Sibling rivalry, resentment, and perceived slights can exacerbate tensions within families. Some sources suggest that Tracy may have felt pressure to support Nick, either emotionally or strategically, as part of a complex network of loyalty and influence. Others propose that her alleged participation was more transactional, tied directly to the $50 million offer and the desire to secure or control access to wealth. The truth, investigators caution, is likely a combination of multiple factors. What makes Tracy's potential role even more alarming is the notion of premeditation. The communications with Nick, the planning around the files, and the timing of actions suggest that these events were not impulsive. There was strategy, deliberation, and coordination. And if Tracy's involvement is confirmed, it raises profound questions about the moral and ethical boundaries crossed within a single family. Public reaction to Tracy's alleged involvement has been intense. Fans, colleagues, and Hollywood insiders are struggling to reconcile her image as an accomplished actress and member of the Reiner family with allegations that suggest she played a role in one of the most shocking domestic crimes in recent memory. Social media discourse has ranged from disbelief and outrage to speculation about the true extent of her involvement. Every leak, every hint of evidence, and every public statement fuels the growing fascination with the case. Yet, even as attention turns to Tracy, the investigation is far from complete. Authorities are focused not just on establishing involvement, but also on understanding the sequence of decisions, communications, and actions that led to the tragic deaths of Rob and Michelle. The $50 million offer, the allegedly erased files, and the interactions between Tracy and Nick form a complex puzzle, one that could redefine the entire narrative of the Reiner family tragedy. Experts in criminal psychology emphasize that cases like this are rarely straightforward. The intersection of familial loyalty, financial temptation, and secrecy creates a situation where traditional motives are blurred. In Tracy's case, investigators must consider whether her alleged role was voluntary, coerced, or a mix of both. Determining the answer will be critical not only for legal proceedings, but also for understanding the human dynamics that led to such a catastrophic outcome. As investigators continue to analyze communications, financial records, and digital traces, one truth becomes increasingly clear. The Reiner family tragedy was not simply a violent act by a son. It was a complex web of interactions, decisions, and possible conspiracies that involved multiple players, each with motives that range from financial gain to emotional loyalty. Tracy Reiner's alleged role exemplifies the intricacy and danger of these intertwined motives. And just when authorities thought they had mapped out the family dynamics and potential involvement, the next revelation emerged, something so unexpected that it would challenge assumptions about loyalty, complicity, and the true nature of betrayal within the Reiner family. When the FBI first revealed the alleged $50 million offer, the world paused. $50 million to erase files. Not to hide a simple mistake, not to cover a minor scandal, but to obliterate evidence, records, and potentially life-altering information. It is a sum so staggering that it seems almost fictional. And yet, federal investigators have indicated that communications, bank records, and corroborating witness testimony suggest the offer was very real. To understand the audacity of the plan, we must first understand the stakes. Rob and Michelle Reiner were not ordinary individuals. Their lives were intertwined with Hollywood, finance, and decades of private dealings. The files in question, though their full contents remain undisclosed, appear to have held information significant enough to warrant a multi-million-dollar bribe. Investigators suggest these files may have contained legal contracts, personal correspondence, financial transactions, or evidence related to long-standing disputes. The very existence of a $50 million offer indicates the perceived value and the potential threat these records represented. Reports indicate that the offer was not a casual suggestion or a fleeting thought. Federal sources claim that Nick Reiner and Tracy Reiner allegedly discussed the terms, the mechanics, and the potential payoffs in explicit detail. This was a plan that required coordination, calculation, and understanding of what would be lost if the files were erased. To put it bluntly, someone wanted control over the truth, and they were willing to pay. And perhaps kill for it. Financial experts examining the case note that $50 million is more than just a sum, it is a statement. In many high-profile crimes, money is a tool for leverage, a means of control. In this scenario, the offer transforms from currency into power. Whoever controlled the files controlled access to secrets, leverage over individuals, and the ability to shape narratives. The question becomes, what was so dangerous in these documents that anyone would risk so much to erase them? Adding to the intrigue is the question of delivery. How does one even propose a $50 million bribe to erase personal and legal files? Investigators have uncovered encrypted communications and traces of discussions in private settings, suggesting the offer was approached with both caution and determination. The alleged conversations reportedly detailed not only the sum of money, but also the timeline for the file's removal, the method of payment, and assurances of secrecy. These weren't casual family discussions. They were strategic negotiations with potentially catastrophic stakes. The implications extend far beyond money. If the files contain sensitive personal or professional information, their erasure could have far-reaching consequences. Legal obligations, personal reputations, corporate contracts, and even ongoing investigations could have been impacted. Experts point out that attempting to erase such files is not just illegal. It is morally and ethically catastrophic. And yet, the audacity of the alleged $50 million offer suggests a willingness to cross lines that most people would consider untouchable. But money alone doesn't explain everything. The emotional stakes were equally high. Families of wealth and influence often operate under immense pressure, balancing legacy, control, and public perception. Within the Reiner family, the offer reflects not just a desire for financial gain, but also a desperate attempt to manage secrets, manipulate outcomes, and control narratives. To the FBI, the offer itself is as significant as the actions that followed. It signals intent, premeditation, and an awareness of potential consequences. What makes this situation even more disturbing is the timeline. Reports suggest that discussions about the $50 million offer occurred in the days leading up to the murders. This creates a chilling possibility that the murders and the financial negotiations were part of the same overarching plan. If true, it paints a portrait of a calculated sequence of events where financial greed, secrecy, and familial betrayal intersected with lethal consequences. Legal analysts are closely monitoring how this offer fits into the broader prosecution strategy. Attempting to erase documents for a bribe is itself a crime, even without the murders. When coupled with the deaths of Rob and Michelle, the alleged $50 million offer becomes a critical piece of evidence in demonstrating motive, premeditation, and conspiracy. Prosecutors may argue that the murders were not just acts of rage, but were linked directly to the attempt to control, erase, or manipulate sensitive information. Public fascination with the offer is understandable. It reads like the plot of a high-stakes thriller, family drama, multi-million-dollar bribes, secrets, and murder. Yet it is very real, grounded in evidence, and tied directly to the tragedy that unfolded in Brentwood. Social media users, journalists, and amateur sleuths alike are dissecting every aspect of the alleged negotiations, from the sums discussed to the timing and participants. The intrigue is compounded by the fact that much of the information is still under investigation, leaving gaps that the public eagerly tries to fill with speculation. Even the nature of the files themselves adds to the suspense. While investigators remain tight-lipped, there are hints that they are far more than ordinary family documents. Some sources suggest that the files contained information that could potentially impact high-profile figures beyond the immediate family. Others indicate that the records may be tied to unresolved legal disputes or personal histories that were meant to remain hidden. Regardless of the specifics, the mere existence of a $50 million offer indicates that these files were considered dangerously valuable. Experts in criminal behavior highlight the interplay between money, power, and risk in cases like this. Offering such a vast sum to erase information is both audacious and perilous. It signals desperation, ambition, and an understanding that the information holds extraordinary leverage. In this case, the offer also connects Nick and Tracy directly, implicating both in a scheme that goes beyond familial conflict into premeditated criminal action. The human element cannot be ignored. While the FBI and law enforcement focus on evidence, investigators also study relationships, motivations, and pressures that could have driven Nick and Tracy to consider such an audacious plan. Psychological profiles suggest that the combination of financial opportunity, perceived threat from the files, and family dynamics could create an environment where extreme actions become conceivable. And the stakes were more than financial. They were personal, emotional, and reputational. As authorities dug deeper, additional details emerged about the structure of the alleged offer. Bank records, communications, and witness statements suggested that the plan was not impulsive. It involved careful calculation, discussions about timing, and contingency plans in case the files could not be erased. This level of sophistication points to a deliberate, methodical approach, heightening concerns about the premeditated nature of the murders themselves. And yet, questions remain. Did the offer exist independently of the murders, or were the two intertwined from the start? Was the $50 million meant to manipulate, to bribe, or to eliminate evidence? Or was it merely a smokescreen, a distraction from deeper motives rooted in family conflict, resentment, or psychological instability? Every answer leads to more questions, creating a web of intrigue that investigators are only beginning to untangle. The audacity of the $50 million offer also raises ethical and moral dilemmas. It is a stark reminder of how wealth can distort human behavior, blurring the lines between right and wrong, legal and illegal, loyalty and betrayal. In the Reiner case, these factors combined with lethal consequences, creating a scenario that is both tragic and deeply compelling. And just when authorities thought they had fully grasped the significance of the offer, the investigation revealed a twist. Evidence suggested that attempts to act on the $50 million proposal may have directly precipitated the murders, linking financial greed with violent action in a way that challenges conventional understanding of motive and crime. The files at the center of the Reiner family scandal are shrouded in mystery. Investigators, law enforcement sources, and even federal agents have confirmed their existence, but the exact contents remain classified. What we do know, however, is enough to send a chill down the spine of anyone following the case. These were not ordinary family documents. They contained information so sensitive, so potentially damaging, that someone allegedly offered $50 million to have them erased. That offer alone hints at the extraordinary significance of these records. To understand why the files mattered so much, we must consider what types of information could carry such weight. Experts speculate that the files could contain legal documents, financial records, contracts, and personal correspondences. They may have held evidence of undisclosed business dealings, personal disputes, or even unresolved investigations connected to the family. In Hollywood and high-profile families, the line between personal and professional often blurs. One misstep, one exposure, can have consequences that ripple far beyond the immediate circle. Initial reports suggest that the files were stored securely within the Reiner estate. Some sources claim they were digital, encrypted, and backed up on private servers. Others indicate the existence of physical documents, carefully organized, hidden from casual view. Regardless of the format, it's clear that these files represented control over knowledge, information that someone considered dangerous enough to remove entirely from existence. The FBI's involvement provided a critical lens into the file's significance. Federal agents have extensive resources for analyzing both digital and physical evidence. Their preliminary assessments indicated that the files could potentially contain sensitive personal communications, financial transactions spanning years, records that might link family members to outside parties, and possibly details of ongoing legal matters. Each of these elements, if exposed, could have catastrophic consequences, not only for the Reiners, but for anyone connected to them professionally or personally. The alleged $50 million offer to erase the files points to another critical insight. The files were considered a liability. Whoever was behind the proposal viewed the information as a threat, something that could not be allowed to exist. That level of concern suggests that the files were not just inconvenient, but potentially dangerous, holding truths that someone would go to extreme lengths to suppress. Investigators are also interested in the timing of attempts to access and possibly erase these files. Communications between Nick Reiner and Tracy Reiner suggest discussions occurred shortly before the murders. This timeline raises chilling questions. Were the murders an escalation of the plan to control or destroy the files? Or were the files themselves a motive, something that led to a confrontation resulting in tragedy? Federal agents are examining digital footprints, timestamps, and behavioral patterns to answer these questions. The nature of the documents suggests multiple layers of secrecy. Some could have been financial in nature, bank accounts, trust funds, business contracts. Information that could be exploited for personal gain. Others might have contained personal or sensitive material, letters, messages, or correspondences that could expose family conflicts or controversies. In high-profile families, Even minor personal revelations can carry enormous social, financial, and legal consequences. The files were more than paper or data. They were leverage, power, and potentially the key to control over the family's legacy. Forensic experts emphasize that the manner in which the files were stored and accessed indicates a level of sophistication. Digital encryption, secure servers, and limited physical access all suggest that Rob and Michelle understood the value of the information they possessed. The Reiners were not careless with their secrets. They had taken steps to protect them, making the alleged attempt to erase these files all the more audacious. The investigation into the files has also revealed connections that extend beyond the immediate family. Some records appear to intersect with outside parties, business associates, legal professionals, and possibly individuals tied to prior unresolved investigations. This broadens the scope of the case, transforming it from a domestic tragedy into a complex network of secrets, leverage, and potentially criminal activity. Each link adds a layer of intrigue and raises the stakes even higher. Social media and public speculation have only intensified interest in the files. While authorities remain tight-lipped about specifics, journalists and online sleuths have offered theories ranging from the mundane to the sensational. Were the files simply financial records? Evidence of undisclosed relationships? Or were they tied to long-forgotten cases, investigations, or controversies that could shake the public perception of the Reiners? The uncertainty fuels curiosity, making the files one of the most compelling elements of the story. Psychologists and criminal behavior experts studying the case note that the files' significance likely had a profound psychological impact on the alleged perpetrators. Knowing the files existed, understanding their value, and realizing the consequences of exposure could create immense pressure, fear, and desperation. In this context, the alleged discussions between Nick and Tracy to erase the files are not merely acts of greed. They may reflect panic, calculation, or both. The files were a trigger, a catalyst for decisions that escalated into the murders. Even the smallest details about the files matter. Metadata, creation dates, access logs, and security measures can all provide insight into who knew what and when. Investigators are meticulously reconstructing every interaction, examining emails, text messages, and digital logs to determine the chain of custody and potential manipulation. Each piece of information is critical to understanding the broader narrative and to establishing motive, intent, and opportunity. The alleged contents of the files also raise questions about long-term implications. If the records included legal or financial documentation, erasing them could have ramifications far beyond the family estate. Trusts, contracts, or legal obligations could be compromised, affecting not only the Reiners but external parties connected to the files. The high stakes explain the extreme nature of the alleged $50 million offer. Someone was willing to pay an astronomical sum to eliminate risk. Despite the mystery surrounding the files, one thing is clear. They were at the heart of the conflict. The alleged $50 million offer, the premeditation suggested by communications between Nick and Tracy, and the subsequent murders all point to a central fact. These records were powerful, dangerous, and worth protecting or destroying at any cost. The human element adds an even darker dimension. The files were not just documents. They represented knowledge, control, and influence over the Reiners' lives. Whoever sought to erase them understood the gravity of what they contained and the consequences of exposure. And the fact that these discussions allegedly occurred within the family adds a chilling layer of betrayal, highlighting how greed, fear, and secrecy can corrode trust to deadly effect. Investigators continue to analyze the files in painstaking detail. Digital forensics teams are working to recover, preserve, and understand every element of the data, while legal experts explore the ramifications of their contents. Each discovery sheds light on why the alleged $50 million offer existed, why premeditation may have been present, and why the tragedy unfolded with such devastating precision. And while authorities piece together these layers of evidence, the question remains, what is truly inside the files? What secrets were considered so dangerous that someone would risk their freedom, their morality, and ultimately, their parents' lives to erase them? The answers, when revealed, will not only clarify motive but may also expose truths that extend far beyond the Reiner family. When the FBI became involved in the Reiner case, the investigation shifted from a high-profile family tragedy to a full-scale federal inquiry. Their presence signaled that the scope of the events went beyond domestic violence, beyond ordinary criminal behavior, and into territory that required specialized expertise. The alleged $50 million offer, the potential destruction of critical files, and the unusual circumstances surrounding Rob and Michelle Reiner's deaths placed the case firmly within federal jurisdiction. The FBI's initial focus was on securing the scene and ensuring that all evidence was preserved. While local authorities handled the immediate arrest of Nick Reiner, federal agents moved quickly to examine the digital and physical landscape of the estate. They meticulously cataloged every document, computer, server, and device, aware that the files at the center of the controversy were both the motive and the potential key to unraveling the broader conspiracy. One of the first steps was digital forensics. Every device in the estate, from laptops and external drives to smartphones and encrypted storage devices, was seized and analyzed. FBI cyber specialists scoured metadata, access logs, and communication histories, looking for patterns that might indicate planning, coordination, or concealment. Investigators were particularly interested in the interactions between Nick and Tracy Reiner, focusing on evidence of discussions regarding the $50 million offer and any attempts to manipulate or erase files. Physical evidence was equally critical. The sharp force injuries, the positioning of the bodies, and the spatial layout of the estate provided forensic clues about the sequence of events. Analysts examined blood patterns, weapon placement, and points of entry and exit. Their goal was to reconstruct the timeline as accurately as possible, identifying moments of opportunity, conflict, and escalation. The level of precision required in this step cannot be overstated. In high-profile cases, even minor oversights can compromise the integrity of the investigation. The FBI also expanded the investigation beyond the estate. Financial transactions, bank records, and legal documents were subpoenaed to determine the movement of money and the potential scope of the alleged $50 million offer. Every deposit, withdrawal, and transfer was scrutinized, creating a detailed map of financial activity that could reveal intent, opportunity, and premeditation. Analysts sought to determine whether the offer was theoretical, exploratory, or actionable, whether it represented idle speculation or a serious attempt to erase evidence. Witness interviews played a central role. Family members, friends, and associates were questioned extensively. Romy Reiner's testimony was critical, but investigators also explored broader family dynamics. They sought to understand prior interactions, potential conflicts, and behavioral patterns that could provide context for the alleged plan. Every relationship, no matter how seemingly minor, was examined for clues. The FBI's approach reflects a deep understanding that motives in familial homicide often extend beyond the immediate crime into patterns of secrecy, resentment, and opportunity. As the investigation progressed, the FBI uncovered layers of complexity. Communications between Nick and Tracy suggested not only discussions about erasing files, but also contingency planning. If the files could not be deleted through normal means, alternative methods were discussed. These findings raised troubling questions. Did the alleged $50 million offer escalate tensions within the family? Did it create a sense of urgency or desperation that contributed directly to the murders? The intersection of financial greed, family dynamics, and criminal action became increasingly apparent. Cybersecurity experts within the FBI worked to reconstruct deleted messages, recover encrypted communications, and trace digital footprints. Every recovered piece of evidence added another layer to the investigation, revealing a pattern of premeditation and coordination that extended far beyond casual discussion. The level of technical expertise required to parse these communications highlights the sophistication of the alleged plan and the stakes involved. Parallel to digital forensics, behavioral analysts studied Nick and Tracy's actions. Investigators evaluated body language, recorded statements, and behavioral cues for evidence of deceit, manipulation, or intent. This psychological profiling helps to establish motive and predict potential actions, offering insight into the complex interplay of family loyalty, financial incentive, and moral compromise. The FBI also collaborated with local law enforcement to manage the narrative surrounding the case. Given the high-profile nature of the Reiners, media scrutiny was intense. Press releases were carefully managed to prevent misinformation and to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigation. Analysts were acutely aware that public perception could influence witness cooperation, potential juror bias, and the broader understanding of the case. Another key aspect of the investigation involved tracing external connections. The alleged files may have intersected with other individuals or organizations beyond the immediate family. Business associates, legal representatives, and industry contacts were examined to determine whether external pressure, influence, or knowledge played a role in the alleged plot. This broader scope transformed the case from a domestic crime into a potentially sprawling network of high-stakes intrigue. The forensic timeline was painstakingly reconstructed. Every interaction, every communication, and every action within the Reiner estate was mapped out. The goal was to create a detailed, minute-by-minute understanding of the night of the murders and the events leading up to it. Analysts examined everything from the entry and exit patterns of the estate to the sequence of weapon use, spatial positioning, and access to files. The results indicated a level of precision and familiarity that pointed toward premeditation rather than spontaneous violence. Financial analysis further illuminated the scope of the alleged $50 million offer. Investigators traced the origins of discussions, explored possible funding sources, and examined potential methods for transferring or concealing money. The complexity of these financial networks highlights the sophistication of the plan and the lengths to which someone allegedly considered going to erase sensitive records. Throughout the investigation, the FBI remained focused on one overarching goal: uncover the truth.